Thank you, everyone, for joining Women's Way's Winter Lunchtime Policy Briefing on Human Trafficking in the Greater Philadelphia region. I am Amanda Aronoff, the proud Executive Director of Women's Way, and joining me is Jen Horowitz, Women's Way's Director of Public Policy. Before we begin, we have a few logistical reminders. First of all, we will be muting participants for the remainder of the call due to the high number of participants and to ensure that any hold music does not interrupt the call. Second, there will be time for questions towards the end of the call. To submit a question, please email info@womensway.org. Again, that's info@womensway.org. Unless otherwise noted in your email, we will state your first name and your question. And if there are too many questions for us to answer during this call, we will answer them by email afterwards. Finally, we are recording this call to add to our Women's Way podcast series. The podcast will be available for download from our website a week from today. It will also be available on our website and YouTube. So now that we've taken care of logistics, let's get started.
Presentation mode is now enabled.
Last year, Women's Way launched a biannual call-in series to raise public awareness and build support around various issues Women's Way is addressing through our public education and advocacy initiatives. We are thrilled to have so many people participating in this call, some of whom are newer to Women's Way. So please indulge me for 2 minutes while I give a very brief summary of Women's Way for those who are newer. For 36 years, Women's Way has courageously taken positions on cutting-edge issues relating to women and girls, engaging and convening people from all walks of life to create a truly collective and, as our mission says, powerful voice for women. Women's Way tackles many complex and intertwining issues, including women's health, which encompasses access to primary, reproductive, and maternal care, violence against women, including human trafficking, workplace equity and economic self-sufficiency for women, and engaging and empowering young women to become our next generation of leaders, just to name a few. We address these issues through 3 key programs. First, we make strategic grants to women and girl-serving organizations, investing critical dollars and technical support into community-based agencies that sustain families and uplift neighborhoods. Second, we lead advocacy campaigns to influence policymakers and mobilize support to affect policies that matter to women and girls and families. And third, our public education programming ensures a broad public dialogue by convening conferences and community forums, hosting issue roundtables and policy briefings, commissioning research reports, and producing think tank summits, all with the aim of keeping our finger on the pulse of the community and building broad public awareness. Our Lunchtime Policy Briefing is one of our newer public education programs, and again, we thank you all for joining us today. Before I turn the conversation over to Jen, who will be discussing our policy work on this issue, I want to tell you a little bit about why Women's Way got involved in the issue of human trafficking. Many people think of human trafficking and bring to mind images of people in other parts of the world, something that happens somewhere else. However, human trafficking happens here in our own communities every single day, and it drastically and disproportionately impacts women. Human trafficking is tied with the illegal arms trade as the second largest criminal industry in the world, and it is the fastest growing. It is truly modern-day slavery. People are trafficked for either labor purposes, including working in agriculture, factories, or as domestic servants, or for sexual exploitation. 80% of human trafficking victims are women and girls. Studies indicate that the average age of a U.S.-born female entering commercial sexual exploitation is only 12 years old. Again, these are numbers for girls and women from our very own communities. Unfortunately, Pennsylvania in particular is a human trafficking hotspot, acting as a pass-through state due to our many highways connecting other major trafficking areas such as Ohio and New York. Human trafficking has many faces in the Philadelphia region. It includes agricultural workers on our farms, domestic workers in our cities and suburbs, legitimate businesses such as massage parlors and nail salons, and young women working Kensington Avenue late into the night. As Jen will discuss in greater detail, Women's Way is doing meaningful outreach and public education work around human trafficking, and we are also working to address the issue legislatively on the state and local levels through our work as the chair of the Advocacy Subcommittee of the Philadelphia Anti-Trafficking Coalition. Women's Way, notably, is the only local organization looking at the issue and the behaviors and needs of the victims using a gender lens. And now I will turn the call over to Jen Horowitz. Jen has been the Director of Public Policy for Women's Way for almost 2 months now, and she has been on the move since day one. Jen has a background in government relations, grassroots advocacy, policy research, and media advocacy. Prior to joining Women's Way, Jen worked for Amnesty International USA, the ALS Association of Western Pennsylvania, and the American Cancer Society. Jen also has experience working in the international development field and in the corporate sector. She has a BA from Bowdoin College and her MS in Public Policy and Management from Carnegie Mellon University, where she was a teaching assistant for numerous courses, including Women and Public Policy. Thank you, Jen.
Thanks, Amanda. Today on the call, we're going to focus our discussion on human trafficking to several specific issues, and I know there are lots of different questions that come up on this topic, and we will try to address as many as possible. So as Amanda said, if you do have questions during the call that you would like us to try and answer, and we will try and answer as many questions as possible at the end, you can send your questions to info@womensway.org. Again, info@womensway.org. And if we're unable to answer your question during the call, we will follow up with you via email afterwards to make sure that you get the information that you need. So as Amanda was discussing, human trafficking is an issue that impacts communities throughout the entire world, including our own greater Philadelphia region. So we'll be focusing on understanding the legal definition of human trafficking in the United States, signs of human trafficking in our communities, both for those on the call who are social service providers or are involved with direct contact for potential victims of human trafficking, and also looking at who is working on the issue of human trafficking in our region and what is being done about the issue. So to start off with, when we talk about the definition of human trafficking, there's one particular piece of federal legislation that has set a benchmark for how we address this issue from a legal perspective. In 2000, Congress passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was the first comprehensive piece of legislation to address human trafficking in the United States. This piece of legislation has set U.S. standards for how we legally define the 2 categories of human trafficking that Amanda mentioned earlier, labor trafficking and sex trafficking. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act states that sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. The Act goes on to define labor trafficking as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of fraud, force, coercion for the purposes of subjugation to involuntary servitude, debt bondage, or slavery. Those legal definitions have really set this, as I was saying, this legal precedent at the federal level, and many states are working to address human trafficking and define it within their own statute in different ways. But when we talk about those ideas of sex trafficking and labor trafficking in non-legal terms, those themes of coercion and force continue to be part of the language that the broader public education efforts around this issue encompass. So when we're talking about labor trafficking, as Amanda gave a few examples earlier, it can look like farm workers who are forced to harvest crops through violence. It can look like domestic servants who are kept in people's homes in really what is modern-day slavery. And it can also be factory workers who are being held in inhumane conditions, often with little to no pay. And when we think about this issue in the United States, it's more prevalent than many people realize. When we talk about sex trafficking, again, those themes of force and coercion are also prevalent as well. The other idea behind commercial sexual exploitation is that we can break that idea of who is being sexually exploited into two different categories. We have minors under the age of 18 who are induced into commercial sex, and we have adults age 18 and over who are involved in commercial sex. And that can often be an important issue when we're talking about legislative initiatives, because so often the question arises, what is the difference between human trafficking and prostitution? And these two distinct categories are often called into question when we're trying to define and address that term. And I'm going to speak about that issue a little bit later on in the call. But it's an important distinction to make, because from a legislative perspective, we want to make sure that we're addressing the needs of both categories of human trafficking victims. Women and men over the age of 18 are definitely sexually exploited for human trafficking purposes, and we want to make sure that any legislative efforts we undertake are addressing their needs as well as the needs of minors who are under the age of 18. So when we're talking about these two different categories, we want to make sure that we're also paying attention to the signs of human trafficking and what does that look like on a practical level. So, as I was mentioning before, human trafficking really focuses around those two ideas of force and coercion. And those themes really resonate with the idea of control, which oftentimes when we're talking about human trafficking, there's a lot of similarities between some of the behaviors exhibited by both human trafficking victims as well as those who perpetrate human trafficking. For the rest of the call, I'll refer to them as traffickers. And the relationship between domestic violence survivors as well as those who perpetrate domestic violence. Oftentimes, a trafficker does not want to lose his or her sense of control over the human trafficking victim. There's a sense of not wanting to leave the victim alone with other individuals. One story that we've heard through our work is that a nurse practitioner was interviewing a patient who came to light as being a victim of human trafficking, but there was an individual who was also a woman who did not want to leave this victim alone. She insisted on being there as part of the interview until she was asked to leave and was interviewed by another staff person. But that sense of not wanting to let go of control of the victim is a very big red flag as to the fact that this may be a human trafficking situation. Traffickers also control victims through coercion and threats, as we've already discussed. Sometimes they threaten to harm the victim or the victim's family. Sometimes it's a threat to expose or shame the victim for engaging in certain acts, and sometimes it's also a threat to report the victim to police or immigration. And it may be that the trafficker knows something about the victim and is saying, well, if you don't participate with me, then I'm going to turn you over and threaten you in that way. It's also intimidation. Sometimes traffickers, once they begin to connect with a potential human trafficking victim, will exert their authority through displays or uses of violence against other individuals. It also encompasses emotional abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and economic abuse. As Amanda mentioned, human trafficking is the second largest criminal enterprise in the world. That means that there is money involved with this. It's not just an issue that affects people, it also has economic implications. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's so hard to capture what that actual figure is, but estimates say it's somewhere in the range of $30 to $40 billion per year. The other sign of human trafficking is also the isolation of the victim. And over time, the victims can also exhibit signs of denying that they are being harmed in some way, minimizing any kind of abuse, or even blaming the situation on themselves. And from a societal standpoint, we are, as a community, also part of this kind of cycle of power and control. Oftentimes, victims of human trafficking, as I started to address with the prostitution issue, are seen as criminals themselves. And oftentimes society further victimizes a victim of human trafficking by really putting them in this position of saying, you are the criminal, when in fact they are suffering at such a high level, and we need to make sure that we are addressing those needs as well. Other signs of human trafficking can be differentiated between labor exploitation and sexual exploitation. Sometimes with sexual exploitation situations, the trafficker of the victim will be significantly older. Statistics tell us that anytime you start to see a relationship where the quote-unquote boyfriend of a woman is more than 10 years older than the actual victim, that's an automatic red flag. Sometimes in a labor situation, if they're going back to this idea of isolation, if workers are not easily accessible, may have very controlled schedules or very limited access to things like bathroom breaks or outside medical attention, that's another red flag. If you have additional questions on signs, we have some great information available that we are happy to send out. I just want to make sure that we continue moving forward in the interest of time so that we do have time to address questions. But if you have specific questions on other signs of human trafficking, what does it look like, we could spend probably an entire hour addressing just that issue, but we are happy to connect you with additional resources. So we're going to move on to who is working on this issue. We've talked a little bit about the legal definition of human trafficking in the United States, what the signs of human trafficking are. Now let's talk for a few minutes about, who is engaged in this process. In the greater Philadelphia area, we are thrilled to be a part of the Philadelphia Anti-Trafficking Coalition. And the coalition is made up of a variety of different social service providers, members of law enforcement, of government agencies, and of advocacy organizations. The Philadelphia Anti-Trafficking Coalition is currently chaired by Covenant House of Pennsylvania and has several different subcommittees who focus on different needs, including direct services, as Amanda said earlier, advocacy, which is where Women's Way is connected, and community outreach and other key areas related to the work. But those working on human trafficking aren't just isolated to Philadelphia. I want to make sure that we also include information on the variety of other coalitions throughout the state of Pennsylvania and also national partners whom we work with on a regular basis to address this issue. Each year, the different coalitions throughout the state come together to really look at what is happening with work on human trafficking, what is working well, what is not working well. Some local communities have success with different initiatives, and really to share information and come together to strategically define how we can continue the fight against human trafficking at a broader level. We also partner with national organizations like the Polaris Project on all of these initiatives, and we are very thankful for their support. To move on from who is working on the issue, it's kind of what is being done on human trafficking. As I mentioned before, there is the national legislation, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, that has really helped to set U.S. standards. Additional resources at the federal level include laws that aren't necessarily thought of as something that's related to human trafficking, but have been very helpful in prosecuting cases of human trafficking. Those include the Mann Act, which is originally from 1910, but was recently modernized, but it does have applications to human trafficking. The Mann Act focuses on making it a felony to knowingly transport any person in interstate or foreign commerce for prostitution or for any sexual activity for which a person can be charged with a criminal offense. So this is kind of one additional resource that we have available in the fight against human trafficking from a legal perspective. An additional resource is the PROTECT Act, which was enacted in 2003 to combat the sexual exploitation of children. So as I was saying, those three acts are all at the federal level. And I want to spend the rest of the time focusing on what we're doing in Pennsylvania and also within Philadelphia to address this issue. Before we move into kind of what is up and coming and what have been some recent successes, I want to spend a few minutes talking about where Pennsylvania stands in comparison to the rest of the United States on how we're addressing human trafficking. Every year, the Polaris Project rates each of the states on their efforts to really fight this issue. Unfortunately, Pennsylvania is at the very bottom of the pool. You know, there are a few states that even below us, but on average, we're about the bottom 5. So that means we've really started this fight, but we have a very long ways to go. Some specific points that Pennsylvania can improve on according to the Polaris Project are ensuring that we have basic sex trafficking statute enacted within the state. Also, more comprehensive training for law enforcement. Also, making sure that we have safe harbor for minors. For anyone who's unfamiliar with the term of safe harbor, it's making sure that minors who are brought in for having been engaged in commercial sexual acts, which oftentimes we don't necessarily know if they're minors right away, but once they've been identified as minors, making sure that they're getting redirected to social services and other resources to really meet their needs as victims rather than as criminals. Also, Pennsylvania failed to have a requirement of forced fraud or coercion for minor victims of sex trafficking. We also are really lacking in having a comprehensive system of victim assistance. Within certain locations, we do have law enforcement, government agencies, social service providers working together at a low level, but as a state, we're lacking a unified network of service provision. Polaris Project also notes that Pennsylvania lacks civil remedy and also vacating convictions. So these are just a few examples of how we as a state can improve our fight to address this issue. One success that we had last year was the passage of the National Human Trafficking Resource Hotline Act. And that act basically said, there's this great hotline that is available that can help people who just want to learn more about human trafficking, who think they know someone who may be a victim, or which victims themselves can call into to say, I need help. And the people on the other end of the phone are able to connect them with the appropriate law enforcement, social services, or resources as necessary. So as I was saying, this act was passed last year by the Pennsylvania General Assembly, and it basically states that certain key businesses and locations need to post the hotline information to make sure that we're connecting people in key areas with resources to really fight human trafficking at the local level. We're happy to say that that hotline information is available in a poster form for download from the Pennsylvania Department of Labor's website. There are several different versions there, so if you haven't had a chance to look at that yet, it is available for download and you can access that. Moving forward into this year, we're very excited for movement at both the local level within Philadelphia as well as at the state level. Back in December of 2012, the Philadelphia City Council Committee on Public Safety held a hearing to better understand what human trafficking looks like in our city as well as what's being done to address it, and to really focus on what we can do as a community to move the issue forward and make sure that we are protecting victims, prosecuting perpetrators, and raising general public awareness of the issue. Women's Way testified at the hearing, as well as many of our partners from the Philadelphia Anti-Trafficking Coalition, members of the Philadelphia Police Department, members of the medical community, and it really brought together the fact that there are many people dedicated to fighting this issue, but we can do a better job of coming together and collectively addressing it through combined efforts. Women's Way and the Philadelphia Anti-Trafficking Coalition are looking forward to what some of those initiatives will look like moving forward, and we're very hopeful as we move into the early months of 2013 to see more activity at the local level. At the state level, we are thrilled to announce that just a few weeks ago, Senator Greenleaf introduced Senate Bill number 75, which is an act that comprehensively amends some of Pennsylvania's statutes to address the concerns raised by the Polaris Project's report, as well as some intricacies of our own laws that really looks to making sure that we're focusing on those themes we've been talking about: prevention of human trafficking, protection of victims, and prosecution of traffickers. And that is being done through a fourth P, which you will often hear about, policy. So we are looking forward to working with Senator Greenleaf and the other co-sponsors, including Senator Washington, Vogel, Farnese, Udacek, Tartaglione, Volkovich, Erickson, Rafferty, Furlow, Solovey, Vance, Pledgey, Hughes, Brubaker, and Leach to move that legislation forward. As I was saying, it's early in the session. We're hoping to see movement on the issue very soon, and we're also looking for other additional initiatives that could be undertaken by the Pennsylvania General Assembly to make sure that we as a state are doing everything we can to meet the needs of victims of human trafficking and make sure that we are prosecuting human traffickers.
Take some questions?
So now we're going to switch over to try and take some questions.
Okay. All right. I have a couple of questions here. The first question I have here is from Julia, and the question is, I have been following Women's Way's work on this issue for the past 2 years and supported the National Human Trafficking Hotline Resource Act. I feel like it took too long for such no-brainer legislation to be passed. I guess my question is, what is the holdup? What is taking legislators so long to recognize this as a serious issue that needs to be addressed in Pennsylvania? And as a constituent, what can I do to ensure my representative knows this issue needs to be addressed?
All right. Well, thank you, Julia, for that question. I think that's a really important issue. So often, human trafficking really doesn't come to the forefront of someone's mind when you're thinking about it as a domestic issue. I was just at an event the other week, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, you know what, I never even thought of human trafficking as being something that happened in my own backyard. I really thought it was an issue that happened in other parts of the world that never even impacted me. And additionally, another woman in the audience for that event had a direct connection to human trafficking. She actually had a friend in the Philadelphia region whose daughter had become a victim of human trafficking. And it was really interesting to hear her thoughts on having never viewed this as a personal connection, all of a sudden coming away from this event and thinking of it as something that really does happen every single day to people, right down the street from us. And so I think that story plays over to our elected officials as well. There are so many different issues that are vying for their attention. And if that's how most of the community feels about human trafficking, it definitely probably isn't an issue at the forefront of many legislators' minds. And I think passing the Hotline Act last year was a good step forward. It's really helping to bring this issue to elected officials' attention, and sometimes it does take a while to pass legislation, and part of that effort is not only educating legislators, but educating community members so that they can get engaged. It's fantastic that you were engaged in this process and were an active supporter of the legislation, but there are so many more people in our communities who just don't even know about human trafficking, and it's not something they're aware of. So part of our efforts, as Amanda was mentioning earlier, are focused on human trafficking awareness. And throughout January, Women's Way and the Philadelphia Anti-Trafficking Coalition have been sponsoring numerous public education initiatives throughout the greater Philadelphia region to really bring this to people's attention and to make this issue more accessible and say, you know what, this is a really important issue. It happens everywhere throughout the world, including our communities. In particular, Women's Way has banners up around Philadelphia City Hall right now and on SEPTA. If you haven't seen them and you happen to be in the Philadelphia area, I encourage you to, walk outside your office, maybe on your way home, and take a look at them, and they will be up for several more weeks. But it's simple efforts just as, even as simple as a sign to really bring this issue to people's attention.
Okay, next question is from Glenn, and Glenn says or asks, I took the GEMS training last September on commercial exploitation of children. Would Women's Way or other local groups like to plan a workshop or explore this in more detail?
I am so glad you got to participate in that training. One of our coalition partners is in very close contact with GEMS, and there has been discussion within the coalition about making sure that we are meeting training needs. There's actually a training subcommittee on the Philadelphia Anti-Trafficking Coalition. Some of our direct service partners do provide training on issues similar to GEMS, but more specific to our own local area, and I think that's a great suggestion. And the coalition as a whole has been doing some efforts, but I think we could definitely be doing more to make sure that that information is accessible to more people. And if people aren't familiar with GEMS, GEMS is a group operating out of the New York City area that addresses human trafficking, particularly around young women and girls. And Amanda, correct me if I'm wrong, it's Girls, Education, and Mentoring Services is what GEMS stands for. I think I got that right.
All right, here's our next question, and this one is a short one, but it's from Anne. Are there any human trafficking statistics for Philadelphia?
That's a great question. Some of the statistics that we talked about are these very large statistics. The one thing that makes it difficult to develop very locally based statistics is that human trafficking really is an underground criminal enterprise. It's very hard to quantify what human trafficking looks like in our own communities. And because we don't have specific pieces of legislation that identify individual cases as necessarily a human trafficking case, for instance, oftentimes a human trafficking case may be prosecuted as a prostitution case, we don't have good data at the local level, and we need to be doing more to figure out how can we better understand what human trafficking looks like in our communities. We know it's there. We know it's a problem. We know it's happening to women and girls, men and boys every single day, but it's very hard to quantify what that looks like in our local community.
We got another question that I think is similar, and you may sort of have already answered it, from Dorothy. And she asked, I've seen many different statistics with regard to the scope of human trafficking. Why aren't the numbers consistent?
Okay. So those two tie together very nicely. In terms of human trafficking statistics, as I was saying, it's hard to quantify a criminal enterprise. And so many of the statistics that we have are based on averages. There are many different organizations working to identify what those statistics are within the international spectrum as well as at the national level, and so oftentimes it's coming together and data sharing and saying, we know it's somewhere between these two numbers. We think it could be more, it could be less, but we think it's somewhere within the range. So oftentimes with human trafficking statistics, you will see that range number given, and it's not because we're not paying attention to the issue, but it's because it's very hard to quantify something that is so often underreported or not even reported at all. So
if more questions continue to come in.
Yeah.
Well.
So at this time, we don't have any more questions. So if you,
they may come up, and
I will interrupt you. If you have another question, please feel free to email it to us, and we will try to identify it. Answer it. And if you do think of something after the call that you would like to know more about, you can continue to send your questions to info@Women's Way, and we will make sure to address your question.
So I really want to thank you all for spending your lunchtime with us, and I hope you will all stay tuned for future policy briefings. I would be remiss if I didn't mention a couple of upcoming events that we have that are really exciting. On February 9th, Women's Way is hosting its 10th annual Women in Influence Conference, sponsored by Citizens Bank Foundation. It's going to be an incredible afternoon, and it's free. So please register at our website, www.womensway.org, under Events. And then this is a really phenomenal event we have coming up. On Valentine's Day, 2/14 at 2:14 p.m. in Love Park, Women's Way will be hosting a free Zumba party as part of the international 1 Billion Rising movement led by Eve Ensler to end violence against women. We hope that you can be part of this movement and join us as we dance in solidarity and move the earth with our collective strength. It is time to end violence and rape against women. To sign up for this event, also, please register at www.womensway.org. It is certain to be an inspirational event. And finally, to learn more about Women's Way and our work, visit our website and be sure to friend us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Women's Way. And one final note, if you have seen our posters and our banners around the city and you would like a copy of these posters to either post up at your workplace or at your church or synagogue or place of worship, or you just want to share them with people, please email us and we will send you some copies of them. They're really impactful, and we've gotten a tremendous response to them. But thank you so much for your time and interest, and thank you, Jen.
Thank you.